News channels stoke chaos to sell ads. Social media sucks our blood for data brokers. The planet burns because of corporate interests, etc., etc. Talking about problems feels like an act of redundancy. Painful, maddening redundancy. Because these problems keep leading right back to the same place, over and over. Once you've followed these roads enough times, that destination becomes grotesquely familiar. It's like you've been there before. You've arrived at the same conclusion before. It's a bizarre feeling. You stand there certain you've been following a new road, a road you've never seen before, and yet there you are. The same pit of mud you were last time, and the same one you realize you will be in next time. We as Americans call this place our home. This place powers our civilization, but so many of the issues that plague us in our day-to-day lives insist on bringing us back to this place. This place, of course, is capitalism. And yet to imagine another system is almost impossible. Capitalism is part of our identity, not just in America, but increasingly around the world. And whenever capitalism presents us with problems, as it often does, we just throw more capitalism at them. Why is this? Why are we so stuck in this system that it seems absolutely impossible to even conceive of an alternative? Well, there is an answer to that, a pretty definitive one, in fact. And we will get to it. But before that, it's important to dispel some of the myths about capitalism as we know it today. There is this idea that capitalism somehow evolved from some natural human tendency, that humans are instinctually driven towards the profit motive, and capitalism is just a name for something that has always existed in one way or another for a very long time. It always has been, and it always will be. Knowingly or not, most people are citing the early capitalist Adam Smith when they make this argument. In the 1800s, Smith saw people trading goods for profit and thought this was just human nature. He said people trade things for other things, and then someone comes up with money and we naturally get to capitalism, whether we try to or not. But Smith just made this up. It never happened. There is no historical or anthropological record that indicates the concept of money emerged from barter. In reality, Smith was already living in a capitalist system. He was just observing the things going on around him. In truth, throughout almost all of human history, resources were exchanged in gift-giving systems based on personal favors. You gave me some fish one time, so here's some milk. This idea that capitalism existed before it was named is simply untrue. People like Adam Smith still say capitalism is natural, that it caters to our human nature in a unique way. This is true. It's also a very bizarre, kind of disgusting way to justify a capitalist system. Greed is certainly within our nature. A desire for intense personal success, even if at the expense of other people, that could be in someone's nature. Capitalism rewards these things, but I don't think anyone would say these are good things. Qualities are not good just because they could be considered natural. Our economic system should not be set up to maximize the darkest parts of human nature. Do we really want the greediest people at the very top of our society? In what world does this sound like a good plan? Still, you will often hear people say that capitalism works. It may not be perfect, but it works. People have jobs mostly and can go about their daily lives. We have iPhones and computers and cars. Well, the people saying that are usually people like me, people who have good jobs, were born into decent circumstances, and came into this world with a not insignificant set of advantages. For those people, yes, capitalism works. I think if you asked people who work 50 hours a week and still live in project housing, they would not be so positive. 8 million people die every year because they can't access healthcare. Over 1 million die because they can't afford good drinking water. There have been millions of deaths in wars fought over material resources. European colonizers killed 50 million native people in the Americas. The British Empire killed 165 million Indians in the name of capitalism. 42 million people in the world's richest economy live in poverty every single day. We have dot-com bubbles, bank bailouts, auto bailouts, stimulus checks. The American capitalist economy is so unstable that every few years it threatens to collapse and can only be fixed by huge amounts of government spending. Does this sound like something that really works? I mean, if capitalism itself was a business, it would have been shut down long ago. Imagine a world where Coca-Cola products kill millions of people every year and require billions of dollars in regular cash injections just to stay afloat. Capitalism cannot even pass the test of its own existence. This is all to say, if capitalism works, it sure is costly to make it do so. Still, people like to say that capitalism has lifted millions out of poverty, so it's the best option. The implication here is that capitalism is working well for the poorest people in the world. But I think if you asked the poorest people in the world, they would not say in general that things are working well. But they are really nice graphs that show us how capitalism has reduced poverty. Specifically, this entire narrative comes from one place. This graph that shows the percent of people living in poverty over time. People will point to this graph and say, look, things are getting better. Capitalism is great. Let's keep on doing it. But this graph basically sucks for 3 reasons. Bad history, bad economics, and misleading data. In 2023, a group of researchers examined this graph and the capitalism eliminates poverty narrative. They studied 5 major regions of the world and looked at human welfare signals in these places over time. The results of their study were pretty clear. Quote, in all regions studied, incorporation into the capitalist world system was associated with a decline in wages to below subsistence, a deterioration in human stature, and an upturn in premature mortality. In parts of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, key welfare metrics have still not recovered. Let's talk about why that is. This graph starts with the idea that 90% of the world's population lived in poverty before the year 1800. The graph's foundational idea is that virtually all of humanity for all of history was starving and destitute until the 1900s when capitalism saved us all. This contradicts about a century of academia on capitalism and human welfare. It's just not true. Historically, laborers and working people have been able to feed themselves and their families pretty easily without capitalism. In fact, based on the major indicators of welfare, extreme poverty has historically been really rare in Europe, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and China. Notably, the exceptions to this have been during periods of famines, wars, and systematic dispossession of land, most often caused by capitalism. Secondly, the pro-capitalist argument and the graph also hinge on the idea that more wealth in a country means a better quality of life. But this isn't true. You see, the graph is based entirely on income. However, personal income has not always determined your quality of life. The graph ignores subsistence farming, foraging, access to common food supplies, and other things that were historically really important parts of life. For example, if subsistence farms are destroyed by colonists and replaced with cotton plantations, GDP goes up. But in that area, access to food and thus quality of life plummets significantly. This isn't just a what-if scenario. From 1870 to 1921, as British people were colonizing India, the Indian GDP per capita increased by 27%. So surely all of these people would have been pulled from their wretched lives of starvation, right? Not quite. During that time, British policies induced famines killing tens of millions of people. The average Indian life expectancy collapsed by 20%. GDP was soaring, but this was the most disastrous period of history, maybe in Indian history. This nice little graph just kind of sweeps all that under the rug. Another issue is that this graph uses the global poverty line of $1.90. When it was calculated, this number was based on an average of the 15 poorest countries in the world. So it's kind of meaningless to other countries. The 190 number is universally accepted to be far too low. This level of income is still associated with extreme calorie and nutrient deficits and an inability to access basic goods. I mean, just think about it. Could you live on $1.90 per day? Only in the absolute poorest countries is this possible. And we all know poor people exist in every country. To correct for this, economic historians have developed an alternative approach. They use price data to calculate a basic needs poverty line. At this poverty line, people can consume an adequate diet, all from the cheapest available foods. The poverty line also accounts for non-food items like clothing and housing. So when we use the 190 figure, China reduced poverty from 66% in 1990 to 19% in 2005 through capitalist reforms. This looks pretty good. However, if we measure incomes against the more comprehensive BNPL, Chinese poverty increased during this same time, from 0.2% to 24%, with a peak of 68% in 1995. Uh-oh. Most strikingly, the BNPL reflects surging prices of food as China dismantled its socialist food provisioning system. Lastly, this graph conveniently begins in the year 1820. But capitalism has existed since the 1500s. During the missing 300 years, capitalist growth depended on horrific processes, including the en masse enslavement of Africans and the colonial genocide of Indians and Native Americans. These processes caused much of the global poverty that capitalism, quote, solved. Indeed, if we use this graph's method for calculating poverty, during these first 300 years of capitalist growth, global poverty went way, way up. By using an arbitrary cutoff date, this graph makes itself look a whole lot better than it really is. And let's not forget, the graph says that thanks to capitalism, people earn more money in a day, and that's good. But capitalism is basically the only reason we would need to earn that money. Say someone puts a gun to your head and makes you eat a bunch of salt until you get really thirsty. Then they give you a glass of water. You're really going to thank that person for quenching your thirst? I don't think so. Still, none of these so-called arguments really explain why we are addicted to capitalism. They are reasons people use to justify this addiction, but none of them are the true reason that America is so content in the arms of this system. The truth, unfortunately, is a lot more brutal. There exists a phenomenon called capitalist realism. This idea says that we have gotten to a place within capitalism that we cannot possibly fathom any other system of economics. In capitalist realism, we have all accepted capitalism as the end point for economic development. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. This is capitalist realism. But this delusion exists for a good reason. Capitalism has created a Truman Show for all of us. We live, breathe, and sleep money. It motivates everything we do. It's suffocating. Our lives have become capitalist enterprises. See, life is no longer a sequence of time, but a disparate series of jobs and hobbies that need to assemble in some way that is profitable. Of course, we can't see past capitalism when we engage in it with every waking moment. Very few people would defend capitalism in its entirety. Instead, what we all hear again and again is that capitalism isn't perfect, but every other system is worse. This is a trick. With millions dying, our environment collapsing, and an insurmountably large wealth gap, even capitalists themselves cannot realistically defend capitalism as a wholly wonderful system. So instead, they pivot. They categorize all other systems as horrible. The dialogue becomes, we may not live in a great system, but you should be glad we don't live in a terrible system. This does not make sense in theory, nor does it make sense in reality. 8 million people die from lack of healthcare each year, but at least we don't massacre citizens like Stalin did. We carpet bomb the Middle East for oil, but at least we don't kill people like Mao Zedong. American citizens die homeless on the streets, but at least we don't have those big, ugly Soviet apartments. Even if capitalism is terrible, imagine how much worse everything else must be. They say all we have to do is lower our standards and we will be saved from tyranny and suffering. This ends the conversation, the exploration of new options, before it even has a chance to start. So we are all convinced that capitalism is the absolute. When we begin to see holes in the fabric of capitalism, well, the system has a solution for that too. Anti-corporate sentiment is one of the things that capitalism is best at selling. Billionaires finance movies about how evil billionaires are.
Hey, we are bullshit.
We sympathize with these movies or books or t-shirts or TV shows. We live through them. these things perform our anti-capitalist duties for us, so we can continue to consume without guilt. Meanwhile, those capitalists who produce them get to placate any anti-capitalist sentiment, all while fueling their own system with each Wall-E or Succession or whatever. We are incentivized to place hatred of capitalism in a nice little box and put it away. Imagine a middle manager, a cool middle manager, if you will, one who lambasts the bureaucratic procedural nature of his work. He disavows it as stupid and needlessly complicated. His inward behavior is sensibly defiant, but capitalism means his outward actions cannot match this behavior. He must still perform his mundane bureaucratic tasks day in and day out, lest he be without a job and fall into homelessness. He's trapped. His actions can never really match his beliefs. Capitalism has become such an amorphous, complicated mess that we don't really know what to do with our anger. Our capitalism is a Kafkaesque nightmare. We live to earn money, and we have to spend that money to live. Even expressing hatred of a capitalist system requires participation in that system. This video, for example, is not free to make, and indeed, like the aforementioned manager, I generate some measly amount of income from it. We are forced to hold on to radically opposed identities throughout our lives, days, and even hours. We can scream into the world, but there can be no hope because the world is an abyss. There's nothing to scream at. No one knows who's to blame, and no one knows who can even do anything. Our bureaucratic mess of capitalism means the concepts of right, wrong, cause, and effect blend into some nonsensical ether. Every minute of every hour, we are blinded, suffocated, and motivated by capitalism all at once. At the end of it all, we are filled with a rage that has no direction, so we just let our anger flicker and die. Our feelings and frustrations remain blunted by the necessities of everyday life. For those lucky few who win at capitalism, they enter the abhorrent bunker of the corporation. This bunker protects them from those on the outside dying to get in. Inside this bunker, there is much work to be done, processes to oversee, protocols to follow. Whether or not they want to hear the discourse outside of their walls, they will not. They cannot. They are blinded to the world outside of their bunker. And so the victors rot. They rot comfortably inside of their steel bunker. As the problems of capitalism continue to rear their heads, those in power do not acknowledge that these problems are intrinsically linked to capitalism as a system. You'll hear politicians blame every issue in the world for climate change, besides the system on which it is built. Instead, they say we just need to throw more capitalism at these problems. They say private enterprise should be trusted to end world hunger and fix our environment. A part of our profit will go to saving the planet. All you need to do is buy more stuff. And so, the loop is complete. You might be familiar with the idea of late-stage capitalism. A lot of what I just described might ring that bell. Today, late-stage capitalism is a pretty abstract concept. People attribute all kinds of different issues specifically to, quote, late-stage capitalism. Today, it's pretty much used as slang, but late-stage capitalism has a strict definition. This cold, crushing feeling has its roots in academia. Werner Sombart was a German economist in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Sombart was not a big fan of capitalism, but he was a huge fan of Karl Marx. Sombart wrote the book Der moderne Kapitalismus, which contained the first instance of the phrase late capitalism. In this book, Sombart divided capitalism into three eras: proto-capitalism, advanced capitalism, and late capitalism. Sombart said that capitalism survived on a cycle of boom and bust. He said that the system had to create wealth and then devour that wealth so as to make room for more. This was called creative destruction. Sombart believed it was not sustainable. Eventually, he said it would lead to, quote, late capitalism. Broadly speaking, late-stage capitalism refers to a point at which the system serves only a few wealthy people at the reckless expense of the majority. At this point, the rich siphon money from the middle class, eliminating it until our society is only the elites and the impoverished. After late capitalism, the exploited would eventually rise up, destroy everything, start a new system. So, you may be wondering, When does that start? I would love to make this video and say capitalism is on its way out. It's dying. Current polls could even help me make that point. A recent Axios poll showed 54% of Gen Z have a negative view of capitalism. One 2020 survey by the marketing and PR firm Edelman showed that 57% of people worldwide believe capitalism as it exists today does more harm than good. I would love to point to these increasingly negative feelings and say this is a signal that the end is near. I could say that there are socialist politicians in Congress. The self-declared democratic socialist almost, perhaps should have been, a presidential nominee. I could run with this and say it's a signal of capitalism's imminent demise. But people have been predicting the end of capitalism for some 200 years now. And yet, we carry on. The capitalist system seems to only consume and grow larger just for the sake of unending growth itself. Still, I am hopeful. I don't know when capitalism will fall, but I can say with the utmost certainty that capitalism will fall. This is a when, not an if. All economic systems die. Capitalism is no exception, and there's no reason it would be. We were hunter-gatherers, and then we were farmers. Then we had a slave economy, and after that, feudalism. Now we exist in capitalism. Those that are benefited most by capitalism will desperately cling on to it just like it currently clings on to us. But eventually, they too will fail, and society will move on to something greater. Selfishly, I do hope this change happens at a time when it is relevant to me and the world that I live in. But who knows? Whether in a year or a century, the death of capitalism will come like the death of seasons. The leaves will die and fall to the ground where they will be crushed into nothing as society walks onward into the future. And indeed, there are a lot of theories about what will replace capitalism. Perhaps it'll be socialism or some other kind of centralized economy. Maybe we will go into a period of degrowth where humanity collectively slows down its consumption of resources for the greater good. There could be some kind of participatory economy wherein people have true agency to decide how they interface with an economic system. Or maybe we'll just revert to some kind of agrarian permaculture economy. Ultimately, while maybe it's interesting to think about, I don't know if predicting a future after capitalism has any real value right now. There are steps that we need to take before we fantasize about a post-capitalist reality. One thing at a time. Karl Marx, of all people, warned against developing recipes for the kitchens of the future. I believe that one day humanity will see beyond the horizon of capitalism and capitalist realism. Throughout history, mankind has fixed flawed systems. Serfs killed their lords. Royal families have been brought to their knees and shot in their basements. These past conquests can signal a new, brighter future for humanity. There's opportunity to be had, and capitalism can be defeated even when we feel trapped by darkness. Just need to turn on the light.